Hello, everybody. My name is Monika Sowińska. I work at the European Commission's Directorate for Informatics in the Interoperability Unit. I am responsible, among other things, for OSOR, that is Open Source Observatory. And today I will be joined by several members of the OSOR team and two guest speakers that I will introduce in a moment. But let's first look at some house rules for today. If you participated in our webinars, could you please display the next slide? So they are always the same. We would be really grateful if you could name yourself in Jitsi. You can do so by clicking on three dots icon at the bottom right of the screen. If you have any question during the webinar, please use the chat. Of course, you will have opportunity to ask questions to our speakers and to the team or later on, but if you want to do it in the chat, please do so. Please mute yourself to avoid background noise unless you are speaking, of course. When other people speak or present, please turn your video to avoid any network issues. I also may switch off my camera during my presentation if we detect any connection issues. Raise your hand. You have this this option in Jitsi if you want to speak to avoid several contributions at once. And please note that today's webinar will be recorded. If the quality is good, then we intend to share the recording. Otherwise, we use it, for the minutes and for preparing post-webinar materials for you. Important information: if the quality of this Jitsi meeting becomes poor, or we get disconnected, which unfortunately may happen, we hope it won't happen, please check your email because we are going to send connection details for Teams calls to continue there, but I really hope that it won't be necessary. So let's start. Please, next slide. So today we are going to continue our discussion about sustainability of open source communities working with or within the public sector. OSOR has already we organized a couple of events on this topic, including the workshop at FOSDEM last year and some webinars. We have also cooperated with some of you. Nice to see you again, on the guidelines for sustainable open source communities in the public sector. So thank you for your interest and continued support. But I also see some new participants, and I hope that more will join because we had quite many registrations for today. So I'm happy to see all of you joining us for today's discussions, and a very warm welcome to everyone. So you see here our program for the next 3 hours. First, I will introduce our speakers and the OSOR team, and I will tell you more about OSOR. I need to do my duty for those that don't know our observatory. Next, we will give a short overview of the guidelines, and we will tell you where we stand with updating and improving them, because this is the process we are going through now. We really want to expand them and improve. Then our two guest speakers will share their insights on the health and sustainability of open source projects in the public sector. I'm sure their presentations will trigger fascinating discussions. Then in turn will provide valuable input to improve our guidelines. So this in a nutshell is a plan what we want to achieve. Next slide, please. And this is the same translated to the form of today's objectives, but I think I have already said everything about it. So let me now introduce our guest speakers. Johan Lineker is a postdoctoral researcher at Sweden Lund University with a focus on how to enable the public sector to share and collaborate on open source software and open data. Johan holds a passion for health and sustainability of open source software projects, researching challenges experienced by maintainers, their impact, and how they may be addressed. He's also a founder at OpenHug, Coding for Humanity, a social company and collaborative community driving open source solutions to most pressing societal and humanitarian challenges. Today, he will share his view on the health and sustainability of open source software projects, so his favorite topic. Johan, if you could show the face to everyone, because your presentation will be a bit later.
Yes.
And our second speaker, Koos Steenbergen, is an open source project manager and the Netherlands Ministry of Interior and Kingdom Relations. He advises his department on policy issues related to open source, and he's advancing the use and development of open source software government-wide. Recently, he started an online learning community on open source. And in his presentation, he will tell more about it, share his experience with advancing the reuse of open source in the Dutch public administration. So, Johan, Koos, thank you very much for joining us today. Next slide, please. So now it's time to introduce our team that is behind organizing this webinar and working on the guidelines and working as OSOR team together. Starting with Maha Shaikh, a senior lecturer at Digital Innovation at King's College London. She holds a PhD in Information System from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Her primary area of research is open source software development and company engagement with communities. She is our expert working with us on the guidelines since their inception. Today, she will moderate part of the discussion that will follow our speakers' presentations. And then, of course, she will help us to moderate discussions on the feedback on the guidelines. And then we have 5 consultants from Wavestone that support the European Commission with running the observatory and updating the guidelines. Starting from the left, Federico, I am not sure that he's with us not today. He's project manager in Wavestone. Barbara, who will tell us where we stand with the update of the guidelines and we manage the feedback session at the end of the webinar. Then Chloe and Vivienne, who will talk about the main guidelines concepts and recommendations. And finally, Corina, dealing with technical aspects of the webinar. Next slide, please. There's only one more formality, let's say, left before we move to the essence of our webinar. Let me briefly present OSOR to those of you that are not familiar with the observatory. OSOR, or the European Commission Open Source Observatory, has been operating since 2007. So we are with you, we've been with you for quite a long time, and we will continue. It is currently funded by the OSSCAR program, Interoperability Solutions for Public Administrations, Business and Citizens. The program has finished. The funding continue over this year a little bit. And then in the future, our work will be continued under the Digital Europe program once it gets adopted. OSOR main role is to provide open source software expertise and information for EU public administrations. We are also playing an active role in the open source community by promoting open source software and helping open European public administrations with adoption of the open source software. Next slide, please. Apart from providing a plethora of user resources, we regularly organize workshops and webinars. We will later tell you about next webinars that we are going to organize in a couple of months. And we attend events, open source events in Europe. By doing this, we are constantly working to develop closer ties to the community and to keep OSOR relevant to your needs, basically. OSOR is hosted on JoinUp, a collaborative platform, and this is what the observatory landing page looks like. As you can see, it can give you access to news items, case studies, and event listings for open source focused events in Europe. So far, we have published over 2,000 articles and more than 100 case studies providing insights into good practices in the use of open source by public administrations and interesting open source projects. If you create a join up account and become a member of OSOR, which of course is for free, it's just registration, you can contribute to the observatory by posting your own articles or information about events and then share it with the broader community. Also, I encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter to get the latest news and information on events, publications, and open source solutions developed by public administrations. You can also enable your RSS feed to get the very latest. Next slide, please. One more information. Thanks to ETranslation, one of the building blocks provided by the CEF Digital Program, another EU program of the European Commission, that was recently integrated with JoinUp, all other content pages, so apart from the landing page, can now be automatically translated into 24 languages. The outcome is not perfect, that it's happened sometimes with automatic translation and maybe even funny, but this feature helps less proficient users of English to grasp main ideas on the published content. Next slide, please. Finally, there is our Knowledge Center that gives access to a variety of resources. Its content is being constantly updated, so you can expect more items, more reports, more features. Please check it yourself. Currently, among other things, you will find the reports and fact sheets outlining the status of open source policy in about 30 countries, and there is more to come. There is a list of open source associations, competence centers, and points of contact in each EU member state. So very useful resource. Also, we provide a list of open source software repositories that are either created by the public organizations or are just really relevant to them. Finally, there are our guidelines for creating sustainable open source communities in the public sector. So the topic of today. And now it's time for Chloe and Vivian and Barbara to tell us more about the guidelines and where we stand with their improving process. Chloe, over to you.
Thank you, Monica. I hope you can all hear me well. So the key output of OSOR that we want to discuss with you today is OSOR's guideline for sustainable open source communities in the public sector. We have put the link in the chat that is accessible on OSOR. So the guidelines have been specifically designed to be a practical tool for the public administrations willing to gain from the use of open source software, either for the internal processes but also to deliver digital public services. We at the Open Source Observatory could see that in spite of the numerous benefits of using open source software, there is a disparate landscape when it comes to its adoption across public administrations. So this varying level of uptake of open source software across the EU is reflected as well in the maintenance of open source solutions, which can be a challenging journey. Indeed, the adoption of OSS can be sustainable only if there are regular contributors or communities around it, which led us to make the to state that public administration need to correctly assess their needs and capacities to join or build an OSS community. And we also observed that the information about online resources for OSS communities needs to be more readily available to public administrations, among, of course, many of our motivations for the guidelines. So this sums up a bit what were our motivation behind the guidelines. And if we can go to the next slides, we decided therefore to to investigate what makes open source communities in the public sector sustainable and put our findings together in those guidelines, which are meant to be a very practical tool to offer recommendations, best practices, resources for anyone looking to adopt or create open source software in the public sector, and to provide users with step-by-step solutions and best practices to foster sustainability, either by creating a community or by joining an existing one. So to do so, we took a multi-step approach to produce the guidelines, starting off with the conduction of a literature review to structure our research. And of course, since the guidelines are a practical tool, we reached out heavily to the OSR community, to the open source communities across the EU. We launched a community survey to better understand the sustainability of the public sector communities. We developed 5 case studies looking at communities in Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, France, and Germany. And we also organized an in-person workshop to gather further feedback. So when it comes to the key findings, those key findings are built on 5 sustainability factors, which we uncovered through our research. So the first one is community vibrancy, which relates to members' motivation, the community's capacity to retain current and attract new members. Um, the second one being a clear governance structure with transparent processes and procedures within the community. Then we move on to public sector adoption incentives, which relates to the nuances of public administration, such as the importance of having support from political leaders, from senior managers, IT experts from within the public sector, raising awareness of OSS, being transparent and open to change. So basically, public administrations looking to start an open source project should become acquainted with the culture of OSS and actively work and engage towards project longevity within the organization. The fourth key factor is technological maturity, such as the quality of the software's source code and its documentation. And last but not least, we have, of course, sustainable founding, how to secure budget, how to plan it, how to plan also and budget the maintenance of the software. So these are the key factors that drove our research. And in the next slide, you can also see that to elaborate on these factors and really understand what was behind the sustainability of open source communities in the public sector, we also found numerous best practices stemming from 5 case studies that were selected to analyze those best practices. So the guidelines team had a closer look at the voice of Groningen. So this Dutch city of Groningen launched a participatory democracy project using a fork of the console software. And one striking element when analyzing the voice of Groningen project was the vibrancy of the console community. So being part of this community allowed the Voice of Groningen team to get technical support when needed. And beyond technical help, the community also shared advice on the design of the online participatory process itself. We also looked at Integrate, which is a digital integration platform designed to reduce information poverty for refugees and other types of immigrants arriving in Germany. So the Integrate solution is maintained by a nonprofit organization which has concluded partnerships with German municipalities, which in turn provide funding to the Integrate team. So that was a really key aspect of this community that we had a look at. The third case study that we analyzed is Developers Italia, and I believe we have some members in this chat and this webinar, which is both a community of Italian software developers and a central open source software platform hosting a catalog where the source code of Italian digital services can be reviewed, maintained, and accessible. So this initiative from the central Italian administration opted for a decentralized leadership structure with every active contributor having the potential to become a manager. So this open structure encouraged contributor to create code as their knowledge and their expertise is recognized. And additionally, the administration also hired developers, created a specific department. So there was a strong recognition of open source software, which was, of course, a strong success factors for this project. We then also looked at Lutes, which is a portal engine that allows users to quickly create a website or web application for public administrations. Um, it's part of operating system and part of content management system that user can easily maintain and add plugins for additional features. And this is the strength of Lutes, to have a robust software properly maintained by the city of Paris, which is coupled by a high level of modularity, which allows other cities to develop their own plugin to tailor the software to their needs. So this modularity was also very, very interesting. And all of these examples that I'm quoting right now are easily accessible on Ozor. You can find more information on all those case studies. And the last case study that we had a look at is oscari in Finland, which is a framework that can be used to build web mapping applications and showcase geospatial data and analyze it. So the initial funding for this project came from the Finnish Ministry of Agriculture. However, other public administrations became interested in oscari and started contributing as well financially to this funding. And a project steering committee was set up to tackle technical issues. Um, so these were basically the 5 case studies that we had a look at. We also intended to have a look at open source communities that ceased to exist or failed for any reason. However, we had difficulties in convincing from a project owner to share information with us. But in the second half of this event, feel free to share any interesting aspect of your own OSS communities or any insights that you may have that could be useful to share with us, to learn more about the success factors of open source communities in the public sector. And I will give the floor to my colleague Vivian, who will detail more about the guidelines content.
Great. Thanks so much, Chloe. So indeed, now that you've learned more about the story behind the guidelines, we will deep dive a bit further into the guidelines content. So the main purpose of the guidelines is to provide recommendations on how to build a foundation for a sustainable open source engagement. This is through the lens of 2 scenarios that a user may encounter when attempting to do so. So indeed, our resulting document is structured into 3 chapters. They begin by detailing how public administrations can set a foundation to sustainably engage with open source. In this chapter, you will find further details on assessing your needs, making your open source project official, and securing the necessary funding to kick off your project. The guidelines also provide recommendations on how public administrations can join an existing community, which is our second chapter. In this one, we detail how to better understand the community behind the software and how to facilitate collaboration as well as contribution. And finally, our third chapter, how to build a public sector open source community from scratch. Here we give advice on organizing the community, keeping it active and engaged, and ultimately expanding it. According to these three chapters, so we will now present you the key recommendations that we made in the guidelines. And ahead of going into detail of these recommendations, we would suggest that you make some mental notes or jot down some notes or even in the chat if it pops in your mind already about which recommendations might be missing in the guidelines. We will come back to this and discuss your thoughts a bit later. And of course, our ideas, our two speakers, Johan and Kose's ideas, as well as your ideas, will serve as input for our discussion later. So firstly, what we recommend is to assess your needs and capabilities. We recommend defining the kind of software that you are looking for in order to have a clear understanding of what you should be looking for on the market. You should also take interoperability into account. Then assessing the IT capabilities of the public administration at hand. For example, find out whether there is a dedicated in-house developer team or whether such capabilities will have to be built. Third, you should assess the software landscape and look for a suitable solution that may be forked and or be used to build add-ons. If you fail to identify a suitable solution, consider launching your own open source community to develop a new solution. Finally, synergies with other public administrations or even academic institutions, be it nationally or cross-border, can facilitate the pooling of resources and exchanging lessons learned and best practices. Second, in this first chapter, we recommend how to formalize and make your open source project official. Once your team has selected the most suitable way to engage in a public sector open source project, the next key step is to formalize this engagement within the public administration. Here, the key sustainability factor is public sector adoption incentives, as political support is a strong enabler of sustainable open source communities. Resources should be invested in demonstrating the benefits of using OSS and to gain advocates of the project. The community should therefore also be part of the public administration's planning. This means giving the community a status, a name, a project manager, a dedicated team, and a budget. And finally, speaking about budgets, you should aim to secure project funding. In order to better understand the project's long-term costs, we recommend considering the so-called total cost of ownership, or TCO. There are various elements to this TCO, such as community management, software maintenance, and also the hiring of staff, among others. As to securing project funding, we can take the example of the OSSCAR community presented by Chloe, where each of the 9 public administrations involved contribute a yearly fee for the development of the platform. Finally, before diving into a new OSS project, you should assess whether additional resources are required to guarantee its smooth implementation. Hiring developers can implement, maintain, and provide support for the software. And sustainable funding is indeed a key factor for an open source community. And then we now enter our second chapter, joining an existing open source community. Before doing so, there are various things to consider as depicted on the slide by our recommendations. To understand the community behind your OSS, the key factor is to have a clear governance structure. This means identifying the community governance model, the communication channels, the manager, and its code of conduct. It is necessary that the structure is compatible with the public administration's way of working in order to ensure a smooth cooperation. Then the maturity of the community will affect how you collaborate with it. There are many benefits. For example, a recent community will welcome new members to even shape the way forward. A large community will, on the other hand, provide you with already extensive existing content and mature open source solutions. You can decide on the best ways to work together with the community to join. You can feel free to ask questions, to contribute to the code, resolve issues, and create documentation. Then facilitate sustainable collaboration. Appropriate procurement procedures are, of course, a prerequisite to healthy collaboration with open source communities. Check whether your country has guidelines of public procurement and open source solutions. And we can take the example of the Italian legally binding guidelines on the acquisition and reuse of software for public administration specifically. Once your organization has chosen the open source solution, you need to decide whether you will be running the software in your own premises, relying on the upstream community to host it for you, or modifying the source code altogether and tailoring it to your own needs. Finally, when choosing to join a community, assess what kind of contribution you are willing to make, such as financial resources, human resources, technical knowledge, and or leveraging the public administration's involvement. Thirdly, in this chapter, how to contribute to the OSS in the long run. Indeed, joining an OSS community is not a one-off engagement. Growth is crucial for a community's sustainability. You can help to expand the community's user base, and you can also plan to pool resources with other public bodies to promote a solution. The community's visibility will also attract new members. Therefore, we encourage active communication with the wider public as well. Then we have now entered our final chapter, building your own public sector community. First things first, understand how the public sector works. Building relationships outside your community will help to boost its recognition. Contributions and resources dedicated to your open source community have to be recognized and valued by the management and employees. This can only happen if other civil servants outside the community understand what it means to be working on an open source solution. A community should also work in a transparent way. Public administrations are known to be hierarchical in contrast with the horizontal and communal nature of open source projects. All of the communities, as part of our case study series, they demonstrated flexibility and agility to work with and within the public administrations. Second, focus on the software. Choosing the appropriate license allows the software to gain visibility. It is good practice to choose one recognized by the Open Source Initiative, and the chosen license should commonly be used in the programming language or the framework system that your project will build upon. Furthermore, a well-known language will allow more developers to contribute to the project and foster its sustainability. Regarding the source code, prioritize quality over quantity. Put testability mechanisms and peer review processes in place. Finally, well-documented software makes it easier to onboard new members and fosters software reusability. Third, organize your community. Clear governance and operational guidance should be agreed upon with the community so it can grow and operate freely, thereby ensuring the community vibrant sustainability factor. For your community to function smoothly, identify the members to whom you will hand key roles. These are management, core technical committee, maintainers, committers, and contributors. Some members should also be responsible for the communication, marketing, and the social media management of the community to gain visibility, as we had mentioned. A community is also more sustainable if it has a common sense of purpose and a shared identity. Working toward achieving a single goal will also help potentially new members to understand the community's purpose and encourage them to join. The rules governing the community should be driven from the bottom up and agreed with new community members. The best way to set out the community's operational model is by putting forward community guidelines that covers topics such as the code of conduct, roles and responsibilities, key procedures, and resources available. An OSS community is driven by the dedication of its members, therefore keep the community active. Rapid and transparent communication is key. You should establish a place for both synchronized and unsynchronized conversations, such as live chats and a forum. You can also set up a central information hub, such as a wiki or a mailing list. Ensuring your community members' motivation is key for long-term sustainability and growth. The three main ways that we found to ensure this and therefore recommend to do is to first recognize your members' work, ensure a transparent decision making, and finally organize regular meetups or nowadays online check-ins or webinars, workshops. And last but not least, grow your community. In order to ensure the visibility of your community, you can create a dedicated website that is easy to access and navigate while providing the most important information about your software. If possible, list your software in an existing national catalog or repository or any other independent ones, as your software may be even useful for small public entities which alone do not have the technical or financial resources for long-term involvement in an open source community. As for events, hackathons, for example, can attract new members to your community. You can also use your budget to set up collaborations with universities, independent developers, private companies, and even citizens. The EU itself also organizes workshops and conferences as well as awards where you could showcase your project and boost its visibility. Thanks a lot. I'll hand over to Barbara.
Thank you, Vivian. Maybe before I start, I see that some people have their hand raised. Ricardo, would you like to say something before we go ahead? Or you can also write in the chat.
I apologize. I did not realize I had my hand up. I just meant to open the chat.
Okay, great.
It's a mistake. My bad.
But yes, anyone who wants to ask a question, the chat is actually quite on fire. I had it was very interesting to read this, and it also relinks very nicely to what I will be introducing right now. So, as just highlighted by Monica at the beginning of this webinar, one of the reasons for us being here today and for hosting this event is that the guidelines are currently under revision, and they're open for your feedback, which can range from comments on specific recommendations, the structure of the document itself, or additional examples that we can highlight. And as I said already in the chat, I made some notes that there was a lot of discussion on forked projects, how to maintain them, how to ensure that the contributions upstream are happening. And this is something I think already that we can investigate. And at the moment, I would like to share with you some of the feedback that we have received so far on the guidelines. Alas, the response rate was rather low. So we really hope to use today as an opportunity to gather additional inputs from you, as this will really help us to ensure that the guidelines meet our community's needs and are actually a useful document for its readers. And also, I would like you to take a mental note of the items that I will mention here, as we will be coming back to this feedback shortly after the speaker presentations in the community casting. So the first feedback, one of the first feedbacks we received was to include more information on good practices when it comes to procuring open source software, to not how to actually procure it in a way that allows you to give back to the software. And at the current moment in the guidelines, we have a recommendation on procurement practices and a reference to the Italian guidelines on acquisition and reuse of software for public administrations. However, procurement is a very complex topic that probably requires a guiding document on its own. So if you have other resources or examples to share on this, as well as good practices, please do let us know. We want to hear them. And the next feedback we got was to translate the guidelines into languages other than English. And as mentioned by Monica, the guidelines can now be accessed in 24 languages thanks to the ETranslation tool that was integrated into JoinUp. And well, since it's not made a translation, the feedback might be not always perfect. But at the same time, once the guidelines are more mature and they're revised, you might consider them translating, making an official translation into some other European languages. However, this is not yet a decision that has been taken. Another feedback we received was to add some recommendations on the approach from transitioning from a closed source product to an open source one. And this sounds like a very important aspect to cover. However, this is a high level feedback. And here, if you have any experience with, either supporting an administration in this transition or transitioning yourself from a proprietary project to a open source one, well, do let us know. I'll be saying this a lot. Do let us know if you have any examples with this, and we can move on to the next slide. Another feedback we received, and I saw some of this already also in the chat, on the importance of promoting the culture and also capacity building on open source. And this is also what we heard, that some advice is needed on how we can actually build competences needed to maintain these projects in public administrations. And one thing that the guidelines talk about is the importance of setting up an open source program office also. And its role, among other things, is to oversee the use of open source in an organization. And by a consequence, a lot of OSPOs, they also end up being responsible for capacity building in this domain. So, of course, this is just one aspect of how to build capacity. So we are sure there's more. Finally, we have more examples of OSS public sector communities. This is always welcome and always very useful for the readers. And the guidelines currently detail 5 case studies, and they're all accessible on JoinUp that Chloe described before. We also identified more communities through the survey that we conducted, around 40 public sector communities. However, we do not have a lot of inputs on them. And if you have any other examples of sustainable communities, or if you are a member of a sustainable community, do let us know. We might get in touch with you, ask you some questions, and see if we can have some inspiring examples to take away. Last but not least, a very important feedback is to add some guidance when it comes to the possible legal issues, such as intellectual property claims. So here the guidelines do offer some advice, and they go into details of legal aspects when it comes to choosing an appropriate license. We talk about the joint licensing assistant and the UPL. But of course, let us know if there are any other aspects, legal aspects that would be covered by the guidelines. And as I mentioned, please, while we go into the speaker presentations, if anything comes to mind, you can already write it in the chat, or take some notes of things that you think could be enriched in the guidelines. So have a think what else should be referenced and highlighted in our document. And with this, I conclude the part of the guidelines. Thank you, Vivian and Chloe, for presenting their structure and their approach. And now I will hand over back to Monica to introduce our speakers' presentation.
So, thanks a lot, Barbara and the team. Before we move on, I see that the quality of the call is getting a bit worse. So for those that join a bit later, important information: if it happens that we get disconnected, you will receive an email with a backup solution, which will be Teams. So I hope it won't happen, but if it's the case, you will get a link in your email box. So please check, but let's keep fingers crossed for good quality. So now let's listen to our guests. For those that of you that have missed the beginning of webinar, our first speaker, Johan Lineker, is a postdoctoral researcher at Lund University in Sweden. He will talk about health and sustainability of open source software projects and why and how we should care. So there will be his researcher view, but with a pinch of his experience with working with public sector. If you have questions related to Johan's presentation, you can post them in the chat, of course, or ask them yourselves during the question time after Johan's presentations. Maha will help us with this whole process. So Johan, our virtual floor is yours.
Awesome, thanks. Let's see if I can share my screen. Can I get a confirmation that you see my screen?
Absolutely, yes.
Awesome, great. Thanks for having me. My name is Johan Lineker, and I'm going to talk a bit more in detail on these terms, health and sustainability, which overlap, and of open source software. I'm gonna take it from a public sector perspective. So I'm gonna give some kind of introduction to these terms, highlight why they are important, mention some of the challenges, discuss what roles and responsibility we all have, specifically the public sector, and also how the public sector, what they can do and what challenges they face in taking on such a responsibility. And I'm gonna end up with some personal experience on doing health assessments and really considering the health and sustainability of open source projects in order to enable use and adoption of open source from the public sector. First, so maybe I don't have to do this too in detail due to a nice introduction, but in my previous research, I focused more on the large company perspective in terms of what they should share as open source, what communities they should engage in order to build influence. And what we also saw there was that there was also a need not just to contribute to build influence, but also to be able to contribute to improve the health of projects that the companies were dependent on. And the last 1.5 years, I've been focusing more on the open or on the public sector, on how they can collaborate on both open source software and open data, and in the best of cases in a synergy. And what I've seen here is that, again, the health concept can really be a way forward to enable more adoption and maturity in terms of open source within the public sector. But I will return to that later. So let's start here. What do I mean by open source sustainability and health? When talking to people and reading people's thoughts, both on Twitter and in scientific papers, people have different definitions, they overlap, but instead of throwing everyone up here, I went to the Merriam-Webster dictionary and looked up sustainability and sustain, and landed in the definition here that an open source software project's capability to maintain that length without interruption and weakening. So this is what I mean by sustainability, because I think it highlights both the long-term perspective here and the stability and robustness here in terms of maintaining a certain level of quality. If we move on and talk about the other overlapping concept, software health, I would make it a bit more general and call it a software project's ability to stay viable over time. So still this long-term and high-level perspective. If we break it down further, you can, from an ecosystem perspective, you can look at 3 different angles in terms of health: productivity, robustness, and niche creation. So my take on that would be that a healthy open source project is one where there is an active development of the project, is robust in terms of that the development is open and spread out over several individuals. So if one or multiple would fall out, the project will still be maintained and developed. And also in terms of openness, that the project is open to influence and contributions from from the community in general. So why is this important? Well, if we look around us in software and hardware, you will probably find that there is open source components in most of them. One recent survey from Synopsys had 99% of the software has at least one component, open source component in them. One from TileLift pointed towards 92%. But I think it's quite fair to say that open source software makes up quite a vital building block in our digital infrastructure. And just as with physical infrastructure, it needs maintenance. If it isn't maintained, there will be cracks. There will be vulnerabilities that can cause harm and large amounts of costs. So when talking about security and robustness, we have to really identify the central building blocks here and see to that they are maintained. I wanted to highlight, if you want to read more on this contextualization, I can really recommend the writings by Naj Egbal on the topic. And I had to include this comic here from XKCD, highlighting that all modern infrastructure, in this case, depends on a project some random person from Sweden has been thanklessly maintaining since 1997. I think we should all be thankful for, in this case, Daniel Stenberg, for continuing to develop the CURL or the current project, which is, I would say, it's being used on Mars and probably quite a lot of places on Earth as well. This brings us to contextualize it a bit further. I'd like to point out this kind of dualism quality, I called it, this kind of spectrum, because in the one end we have people who, in one way or another, think that open source is full of vulnerabilities and bugs, or receptible to them, and due to the openness can be exploited by people and cause harm and costs. And then in the other end of the spectrum, you have the maybe more proponents that always think that open source is more secure and better option than the proprietary alternatives. So in the last 1.5 years, I've met both here, but with a high weight towards the first category here. That basically and this can be people who just know open source by name and associate it with vulnerabilities, and that you shouldn't use it, you shouldn't consider it in the acquisition process. But there can also be people who are quite knowledgeable on the topic, sitting in IT security or cybersecurity, basically saying no to considering open source alternatives in the acquisition process. So we have some kind of knowledge gap here. From my perspective, I wouldn't say that any of these two statements are generally valid. From my perspective, it boils down to the health and sustainability of the actual open source project. So one example we can probably many of you know is the Heartbleed bug, which was introduced in the Open SSL cryptography library, which is used in a large portion of the world's connected devices. It was introduced in 2012 and fixed in 2014, which basically enabled access to private identification keys and what could follow from there. So this, I've heard this used as a bat by call them skeptics in the last slide as a reason why you should not use open source. Well, if you boil down, the real world here was that it was, at the time, it was maintained by two, maybe one more individual at the introduction of this bug, while at the same time it was used by almost everyone. So we have this many eyes effect, which is basically the more famous Linus law, which states that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. If you strike out all and change that to many, I could kind of agree. But the main issue here is that it actually requires that enough eyeballs actually reaches the code base, and this is a big problem here. The reason can be many. It can be that the organizations and individuals believe that the project has been around for such a long time, it is stable, it doesn't need, and it's in maintenance mode, it doesn't need our contribution, or there is all of the large corps are probably maintaining it. It's okay, it's safe, or they don't know about it. It's in the middle layer. It's not front facing, or it can be that it's old or using C. Not hip enough. So there can be many issues here for why people don't reach the actual code base. So we're throwing out this statement. So development resources are depleted. So maintainers are humans, they are not robots. So they have a certain limited amount of time and energy each 24 hours. So they can lose interest, they can burn out in worst of cases. Things happen like change family and working conditions. From a company perspective, they must adapt the corporate strategy to stay competitive, innovate their business models, come up with new products, refactorize their technology stack. These are all examples of things that can affect the health of the community and the robustness, or really cause hurt to vulnerabilities can come up and not be managed. So who's responsible for ensuring this software quality? Is it the maintainers, or the developer, more smaller developer community, or the much more broader user community? And how do we differentiate between individuals here, and companies and the government? So if we look at the physical infrastructure, at least in Sweden, the government is responsible for maintaining the pavement on the roads, looking after cracks and making sure they are secure. While maybe on a much more local level or in other parts of the world, it's much more up to the local inhabitants, the citizens, to care for this. And I've also seen examples in the US when driving around where companies sponsor the maintenance of certain road patches. But if we want to ask this of the public sector, we really need to make sure that they mature and really know what open source is, both in terms of culture and as a development method and so on. So when talking to public entities in Sweden, at least, and especially on the municipal level, I've heard several occasions that they're really challenged here. First, in terms of culture, this openness is it part of my directive? Why or mission? Why should I care? Why should we open this up? How do you work in a community? Okay, so how should I collaborate? And then this knowledge aspect of what open source really is, what the license implies, the multiple different types of licenses, copyleft, permissive. And then again, going back to this dualism of quality, where a lot of people that I've come across think that open source is just connected with bugs and vulnerabilities. And then there's the resource perspective here. On a municipal level, a large majority don't have any internal developers. So everything has to go through acquisition, public procurement. So this is really key, and as was mentioned by Barbara before this presentation in the feedback to the guidelines. So acquisition and public procurement is real key. But again, this ties back to the previous point in the terms of culture, knowledge, and resources. Because the municipalities on that level, they don't know, they don't have the mindset of asking, are there open alternatives? And if they are, they don't know how to answer the following questions in terms of, is it secure? Who can provide support? Are we expected to do this ourselves, and so on? So there is a large need here for support and direction, both on a general level, but also very connected here to acquisition and public procurement. So to give you some examples here, one approach is the OSSCAR approach, which Barbara touched on as well. So here we can find an example from Italy. Probably Ricardo can fill out in the chat or shoot me down if I say anything wrong. But so the OSPO, or the Open Source Program Office, it's a construct or a function that it's very established in industry. So it's a construct or function within an organization that helps to the organization to mature in terms of open source, adopt it, work with compliance, develop, and how to grow communities, how to collaborate with communities, how to create their own community. So we're really a bearer or a driver of this open culture mindset within an organization. And in Italy, well, they have this national competence center, and they are planning on or in the process of rolling out regional competence centers, which you could compare to government OSPOs. And there are, you see this movement, you have the OSPO emerging on the European Commission level as well as other places in Europe. And I think Paris and France on the national level are either considering it or on the way, at least from what I've read and heard. But please correct me in the chat. So what I find interesting and quite unique with Italy is that they actually have a law here requiring the use and release of open source software on a high level. But it wasn't until recently as I've understood that this has actually been followed up or had an impact. So they created these decision modeling guidelines that was referred to before in terms of how the public entities can consider open source alternatives in the acquisition process in terms of development. And it picks up on both business aspects like how to evaluate the total cost of ownership, but also technical aspects in terms of requirements fulfillment, professional support, but also most interestingly in this case, the health or the viability of the open source project, quoting through the assessment of visible indicators on the repository, such as code activity, release history, user community, and longevity of the project, and so on. And we have the link here, but you saw the link before as well. So another approach I like to highlight, I call it the foundation approach with an example from Denmark. So in the open source world, it's quite common that individuals and organizations gather in these proxy organizations, these neutral and independent bodies, where even companies with competitive interests can collaborate and talk to each other and share knowledge. So in Denmark, you have this OS2 collaboration or association between municipalities, which enables them to spin up projects either by one municipality or several in collaboration. And then they have this ecosystem of 60 plus vendors and service suppliers that they can collaborate with. So they have processes and knowledge on how to work for acquisition and public procurement with this ecosystem of vendors in order to have this open collaboration. And they also have these governance and collaboration models needed. So you can read it more about it at that place. So the last example I'd like to take from Sweden. So we about a year ago, we created this network for open source data where we share knowledge basically on how to adopt the use and collaboration on open source software and open data. So we have these monthly workshops with 80 to 120 participants. I think we have had representations from 300 different agencies or public entities thus far. So we really have reached a high impact here, and we, based on inspiration from, for example, Italy and France, we've also created our own software catalog where we gather open source software used by public entities in Sweden, which has really also had a quick impact. We hear how different public entities call each other when they see, okay, you're using this tool, how was that, and so on. So really providing this ground floor for networking and talking, connecting and sharing knowledge, especially in terms of using and adopting and procuring software related to open source. So as we noticed in the case of Italy, and also as we noticed at least in Sweden in this knowledge network, is that the health assessments is really key here in enabling the acquisition process. So again, going back to this dualism of quality, is the project secure? Is it viable long term? So it enables comparisons between open alternatives, but also towards closed alternatives. Can we trust the software here, even though there's no proprietary vendor, or can we buy the support from someone? And this is also an important aspect in health assessment on dependent projects, and this can be projects that a specific public entity is dependent on, but also the society in general. So I think the European level, but also the Linux Foundation, has done work here in identifying different projects that are critical for our general digital infrastructure and in need of support. So really identifying projects in need of support and then doing this proactive risk management and security work, or just being a good open source citizen. And for this, you need tool support, you need processes, you need guidance, and so on. So this was, I quoted this from this executive order quite recently from the White House, that there is a need for criteria that can be used to evaluate software security, including criteria to evaluate security practices of the developers and suppliers themselves. So there is a lot of things being done here. Looking at the Linux Foundation, you have you can look up the Core Infrastructure Initiative, you have the Open Source Security Foundation. But one thing I'd like to highlight is the CHAOS project, which stands for Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software. So this was initiated in 2017 and has really grown to a comprehensive framework with different metrics for health analysis and assessments of open source projects. They have 5 focus areas: value, risk, evaluation, evolution, and diversity and inclusion, and so on. So I really recommend to look this up. It's a good toolbox with a lot of metrics that can be used to analyze the health, both in both use cases, both in terms of in the acquisition process, but also when analyzing dependencies. The thing is, though, that you will need this high level of maturity in order to adopt them. At least that's my perspective. And so you will need to systemize these and put them into a context and a process specific to your country, your procurement rules, and the specific entity. So this is just one example of a framework that I found quite interesting by Bilgin Ibrahim. You have the link in the bottom right, so you can read more about it. But it really gives you an overview on how you can systemize it and look at it from a top-down and bottom-up perspective. So I did a qualitative approach to this, working with the Swedish Public Employment Service, where they were interested in looking at 2 different e-archiving solutions. So I did, based on CHAOS and also the recommendations by Red Hat that came out quite recently, I put together a list of legal aspects, governance aspects, accessibility aspects, diversity aspects, professional support, the social activity, the development activity, the quality, and so on. And this really helped them to evaluate these different open source alternatives and this pre-work to the actual procurement and acquisition process. So here we some lessons learned here that in order to create trust in the alternatives, especially open alternatives in comparisons to proprietary ones, there need to be a comprehensive and thorough process to really address the different perspectives here, while still being easy to maintain an overview, which can become difficult. This requires a qualitative focus rather than the more quantitative ones that you can get from different tools. And again, there is a need for evaluation support. This is not a competency that can be expected of every public entity. So some final takeaways. Health and sustainability of OSS is key for us in order to secure a robust and digital infrastructure. And I think public sector, as well as everyone else, should consider what responsibility we have in terms of contributing to the health of open source projects that are central both to us, but both on a general level. And public entities, they need support and direction here. And I think these guidelines are awesome, and they can definitely provide some good input here. And there are other initiatives, as well as the standard for public code by the Foundation for Public Code and so on. And I also think that health assessment here should be integrated as a key practice in the public acquisition process. But again, this is a knowledge question that needs to be filled and addressed. So, virtual applause. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Johan. That was a very interesting presentation. I hope everybody can hear me fine. Are there any questions? I'm just checking. There are no hands up that I can see at the moment, but please give it a few moments and have a think about it. We've got a good 7 minutes for questions. Not as many as we thought, but we at least have at least another 6 or 7 minutes. I have a question and I'm going to kick it off, but this is only because I'm waiting for other people to step in. So, Johan, you talked about public and private partnerships, and you also talked, actually, let me focus on the procurement issue because that seems to be a key thing here. You said that some of this, the idea of a healthy community and a healthy, sustainable community actually does raise issues of, within the public sector, of procurement. So do you have any particular concerns here, because you raised the claim, but I was wondering if you knew of any particular issues with procurement that we could also focus on in our guidelines for the future?
I think really providing guidance in terms of the one aspect that I want to emphasize extra is the health and security aspects, because when talking to public entities in Sweden, one big reason for why they don't consider open source alternatives when acquiring new software is that they believe it's combined with vulnerabilities and so on. So by considering this health and sustainability aspect and creating a process for it, I think you can really give a pragmatic and a more objective answer to those concerns, so that you can more equally compare open alternatives to each other, but also to proprietary options. So I think the Italian guidelines here are a good model, but really going deep and providing specific guidance for the specific countries in terms of these different parts or puzzles in the puzzle.
Sure. We have at least 2 questions. Their hands are raised, and I'd love it, Johan, if you could cover both, at least these 2. There might be a few more, and we have 5 minutes left, just to give you an idea of time. So first Noel, and then Gerardo. So Noel, please just unmute yourself and speak up, please.
Hi. Morning. Quick question. So within the public sector, the open source communities and the public sector, do we see that the coders are the actual users of the software they produce?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Do you see that the coders, which are the developers of the open source code itself, do we see that they are the actual users of that code?
So, as I said, at least from the Swedish context, the public entities, with exception from certain national agencies, government agencies, they don't have developers. So the actual coders are hired vendors, consultants that do any adaptation to the projects that are used.
I'm asking this question because for me, maybe I'm taking this the wrong way, but within a community, there is something that you gain for yourself, So when you're a user of the thing that you're doing, you're actually getting you have a vested interest, which is not money.
Yeah. So it's like the public entities, they do the development, but with the consultants and vendors as a proxy in some way. So if that answers your question.
No, yeah, it does. And then I see a massive difference between that approach and what happens in life outside of the public sector.
Exactly. So in this case, this creates some kind of stiffness and a more stale development process, because it really distances the actual public entity from the community by having this arm's length to the actual development of the project, which is a big difference to the private sector or in companies, startups in general, where the manager and the actual developer are next to each other.
Thanks.
Gerardo? I beg your pardon, Gerardo. I'm not sure why we can't hear you, but please do feel free to type your question. I'll have to reset the browser. No worries, Gerardo, but perhaps you could just type your question and you'll get Okay, he's gone. Right, great. So, any more questions? Because I have a few more, but I'd really rather let the audience ask first.
I can
Okay,
answer
so,
any questions in the chat afterwards if there's.
sure. No,
If I
great.
may,
Yeah,
Aha,
sure.
I have one question.
Yes, please.
Because I have a particular interest in this webinar,
Absolutely.
and I have our guidelines in mind all the time. So there was a moment that there's Johan just make it clear that like what the biggest challenges when you are to summarize that are faced by public sector when it comes to using, adopting, developing, interacting with open source. It's lack of culture, knowledge, and resources.
Yes.
So we are trying with, helping with two last aspects like knowledge and resources. Culture, it's a process. And one of the things that you personally are involved in this open source and open data networks or organizing webinars. Sorry to use the word, but this is probably the best, shows the what is behind it, educating. But what are other things that can help, to speed up this process or start even in some cases? That definitely personalization, which was mentioned by Noel and you, that what happens that developers in public sector very often to work as consultants, contractors, and they just get tasks to do, but it's not always the case. Even in the commission, we can observe that people, they are working on certain software, they use it, and the same for citizens platforms that were mentioned earlier, like the CDIM and Consul, so developers that work within the public sector on those platforms, they are interested. So this is one aspect, personalization. I don't know how to get there, but what are other things that you think could help here?
So one, I hope I am answering your question, but one way forward to work with culture is to really find a concrete project to start out with. Much like when you start an in-resource initiative within an organization, it's about finding some kind of minimal viable project that you can start working on and then learn from, and then you create processes and adapt and build culture from that. So looking at in Sweden, there are one example of an OpenE platform that they've started to work on now for a couple of years. So that's one way, one place that they can move forward from. But now there are other places in Sweden where they're talking about the social management system that they need to start up with something. So finding these seeds and starting to facilitate the collaboration here. So I think this facilitation thing needs to be provided from somewhere, be it the National Agency for Digitalization or some kind of confederation or association for municipalities. But there needs, I think, some kind of facilitation or coordination here. But it can also come from maybe one or two municipalities where there is this evangelist, this person who really feels for the topic and knows about it. That's usually the way how a large organization matures. There is a bottom-up activity from developers, but then they find this evangelist or this bulldozer of culture in the top of the organization, in the C-level or just below, that can really push this forward.
Okay, so I prefer the word a leader or, visionary,
Yeah.
but I understand what you mean, and thanks. So it's one thing is to start small, bottom up, and the other to think about nurturing with some more structured approach by the public sector organization and decision makers within the sector. Thank you very much for your answer.
Thanks.
Gerardo? Gerardo, I did promise you, so I hope you're there.
Okay, I think that we can move if Gerardo, any time that he manages and he tames his equipment, or the connection is better for him, he can always get back to his question. We have still oh, hi, we have Gerardo. Can you hear us? Can you ask your question?
I can answer it text-wise in the chat if you want to move on.
Yeah,
no, we can hear you. Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry.
That's another option. So, Johan, thank you very much for your insight and sharing with us your experience and knowledge. And now it's turn for Kos Steenbergen to talk about his experience as an open source project manager at the Netherlands Ministry of Interior and Kingdom Relations. He advises his department on policy issues related to open source, and he's advising the use and development of open source software government-wide. He recently started an online learning community on open source. There is a very interesting open source toolbox on the platform that they created. And the government in the Netherlands also commissioned a very interesting study on open source communities in the Netherlands. And I understand that whatever happened afterwards, it's built on the knowledge that comes from the study. So Kos will now tell more about it and about his experience in advancing the use of open source in the Dutch public administration. So, Kos, it's your turn now.
All right. So, sound check.
Perfect.
Perfect. Great. Then I will share my screen. Let's see. Okay. And now you see my presentation?
Yes.
Great. All right, here we go. I'll put it on full screen. So this is me, Koos Steenbergen, and I will have to bore you for a few minutes with some of the Dutch bureaucracy, just for you guys to have a good idea of what it is I do. So I work with the Department of the Interior. I work for the State Secretary, who has oversees all the policies regarding the digital government, and this means our policies are directed at the state level, but also include the decentral governments, which are the provinces, the municipalities, and also, of course, the water and dike authorities. And this makes my work also a bit complicated regarding that. Well, the policies we make, they in some way have to help or adhere to all the needs of all these different government levels. What we did last year is we put out a letter to our parliament in which we introduced our new policy, which is open unless. So this means that in this letter we ask all governments to choose open source, prefer open source in all their projects, unless there are good reasons not to. And I joined the team last year, just before the letter got out, and I thought, well, now at this point, all governments will start making moves towards open source. They will call us, and then they will need help. But I was surprised that, or maybe not surprised, but a bit disappointed to notice that most governments really ignored this policy issued by us, open unless, and it was business as usual. So we started thinking, okay, what can we do really then to help governments make this transition to open source. And it's been mentioned before, there's also in the Netherlands a lot of a lack of culture, knowledge, and obviously resources. So we started thinking, what can we do? And I will tell you a little bit about what we did. We first of all formulated 3 goals, which we are working on right now. And obviously we just had elections and a new cabinet is being formed. So it's possible that in a new cabinet, there will be maybe a bigger ambition and more resources to promote and advance open source. But for now, these are the goals we are working on. And the first one is promote skills and awareness among government professionals, improve the conditions for the long-term adoption of open source software. And last but not least, practice what you preach. Well, the first one, I think, speaks for itself, and I will show you the toolbox we made later on. The second one is really about two challenges. The first, and has been mentioned before, is the procurement procedures. This is obviously a bottleneck for really using and developing open source ourselves. One of the main goals of the policy letter we put out was that we believe that governments should publish more of their own code, which they have developed themselves or they have made by consultants or whatnot, just from the perspective of transparency. People should be able to understand and check the digital solutions being used and the programs being used to, well, make decisions regarding their life, getting a subsidy or something like that. This is really, the transparency was the main issue there. And this is also an issue which is very much supported, but still people in government, policymakers and also procurement advisors, they need more direct tools or maybe a plan to how to implement it, how to really work with open source. And so we're working on improving those conditions. And a second one is we have the open unless policy, and we got a lot of questions about, unless why, in what conditions should we not use open source? Well, especially when there are maybe vulnerability issues. This is always an argument that's being used, or otherwise there are maybe some procedures, government procedures, which you do not want to make transparent because, well, it shows maybe a secretive aspects of the work we've done, maybe within well, police and other institutions. So these are things we are at now trying to research and to make clear to ourselves. Are there things of the government, the procedures which we really cannot make public? In what instances is open source not an option? And my belief is that this category will be quite small, and there are a lot of reasons and possibilities to always use open source software, but we have to make this more concrete. And the last one, practice what you preach, is to make a strategy for our own department, to start with our own department, because I have learned that trying to make policies for government-wide is very complicated, and you know what, you need a lot of support, statewide, nationwide, and this process takes up a lot of time. So we decided, well, let's focus first on our own department. So what is our strategy? How can we move forward, looking at our own packages of software and the systems we use and develop, and also to set a good example. So these are things we are working on at the moment. I already said something about the toolbox we've made, and I would like just to give you an idea. It is in Dutch, obviously, so just a few of the attendees will understand. But what we did is we made a website, and we tried to make different themes. So there is legal, costs and benefits, how to publish code, which licenses there are, and what are the different aspects of these licenses. And just to, this is something about licenses, some in English as well. The idea of this website is it is really to have a low threshold to inform like anyone who just wants to know more, a little bit more about the topic, to give them a chance to learn more. There is a newsletter, a monthly newsletter, in which we highlight projects which are being operated in the government, to do an interview with people who are involved, and just to frame the subject more as something that concerns all. It's not just a technical issue. It's not just something for developers or procurement specialists, because we believe, like I said before, that some of the drivers behind moving towards open source are really in the public interest, and they concern us all. They concern everybody who's in government, and especially, obviously outside as well. And just to advance the idea that we all maybe in government should have some idea of what this concept entails and why it's maybe also important to you, because, well, most people in government at some point need a technical solution for something. They need a piece of legislation they are implementing or whatsoever. And we thought, well, we should do a broad campaign on informing them. So, well, at this moment, we have about 500 people. We started like 6 months ago, who follow the newsletter, and also a community page which people can ask questions and we try to reply. We also put our own ideas on there and really engage the community in thinking about the policies. What are the right policies? What are the buttons we need to push to really advance the use and adoption of open source? So that's what we do here on this page. And also we publish all the research we conducted over there, and people have a chance to reply and think with us how to further the insights we get from research and implement them into policy. We go to the next one, because the last year, because as I was saying, there is not a lot of experience within Dutch government on really developing open source ourselves, setting up a real project, setting up our own community, like also the report about the guidelines addresses like what to think of. And so there was really a sort of a ground zero situation. And then obviously all of you know that COVID hit, and there was a need for a notification app. And I will tell a bit about this because it was really an interesting process. They started out in a more classic way. So there was a sort of a market consultation, and like 8 or 9 projects gave a presentation, mostly big IT corporations. And well, obviously the trust of the users is a big issue. Like how transparent is it? Are the data safe, etc. So transparency was key. And well, they thought this is not going to work. We need a different approach. There was a lot of driving also from the let's say the public. Some NGOs who were really pushing for the fact that it should be open source and privacy by design, etc. These kind of issues. And so they started all over again, and they said, okay, we're going to do it in a radical, more open way. And obviously, what made this possible, and then I just have the GitHub link here, just to give you an idea, that this was also a situation of, well, an emergency situation. So procurement laws could be set aside for a moment because of this very unique situation. And what we are doing now, there is an evaluation going on of the development of the notification app. It has just started, and I'm not directly involved. It's done by a different a bureau. And but one of the questions is, okay, how can we in normal circumstances also work in this open way in which we can have different kind of type of contracts, and contracts which make it more possible for different types of more smaller developers and advisors to join a project instead of the way we are used to. And this is a big procurement and for multiple years, and there's also a lot of risk for lock-in, obviously. And what can we learn from this process to work in a more dynamic, loose way in the future? So it's going to be very interesting to see how we learn from this project in the coming years. Well, as I said, we also put out a few of our own researches last year. We had one about the costs and benefits of open source, in which researchers was a big issue for them to really make a good point and give good numbers on what are the exact financial costs and benefits. I'm not going to go into it right now, but we have it also on our page. And another one was more about procurement procedures and learning from procurement advisors telling us that, yeah, well, we support the open unless policy, but what we really lack is something how to make this concrete, how to put it in a set of demands, for example, or in contract issues to really make it concrete. So we are working on a project now with them also to help them maybe more of some kind of a project in which we can help them to make it real concrete, step by step. What should you put in a procurement? What are the demands, so that open source companies have more of a chance to really engage in these procurements. And a last one we did was a research on open source communities, and it was more one of a qualitative research in which it describes the development of open source in the Netherlands. It was really confined to the Netherlands, and to see in what way governments at this point are already interact with these communities. And obviously, one of the conclusions was that this is very scarce. And luckily, we got a few good recommendations on how to advance this in the future. I think a few of them are similar to the guidelines by OSR. They start with put on the agenda the need to tender differently. This is obviously really a challenge for me. I'm speaking with a lot of people within my own department and other departments. Is how can we look at the way we tender and we procure? How can we make different policies so that we can do a different move towards a different practice statewide? And what I obviously then encounter is the lack of knowledge about what open source is. People tend to think about the fact that it's free and vulnerable. These are the two things I hear the most. So we are working with our platform and different organizations also into really putting down a counter narrative, and that these ideas are a bit backward, and we focus on the opportunities it poses, and also on the issues, the importance of, like what I earlier said, that the arguments that are to be made just for the public good about reusability and transparency. So we try to encourage practical experience. In this year, we are going to try to organize a few hackathons with some governments, and in this way position open source even more as a standard instead of something you might pose as a belief. We get that a lot as well. It's like, yeah, you have believers and non-believers. We're trying to move away from that. It just is like a standard. It should be a no-brainer. Always, as the policy always says, always first explore the options to do a project in an open way. And if there are really good reasons not to, then don't. This is also a challenge for us, working together with more developers and getting their input in the way we make policies and also the way we tender. So in Holland, we have a code for NL. It's an NGO organization, a loosely based organization all kinds of developers, just with a, let's say, a big heart for the public good, and we try to work with them on these issues as well. And last but not least, to make some kind of a visualization of the open source ecosystem in a way that just policymakers can understand what is it we are talking about and have some idea of the gravity and base of it. Okay, those are the recommendations. I believe I have one slide left, and that was the Q&A one. I hope you found what I said interesting, and obviously that it raised some questions, which I'm more than happy to answer.
Thanks a lot, Koos. That was interesting, and you raised a lot of interesting issues already. There are a couple of questions that I'm not sure directly to you or more generally in the chat, but I'd really be happy to see if any hands are up, because I'm checking and I can't see any at the moment. Dominique is asking what's the other way, but I think she's asking that of Gerardo rather than you. Simon Phipps is saying working out how to make tenders deliver engageable open source is the key problem to unlock. Do you agree with that?
Let's work out to yeah. So what do we need to unlock?
Simon is saying working out how to make tenders deliver engageable open source. So I'm not sure what he might mean by engageable open source here. Maybe
want me to chip in there?
Yeah.
Sorry?
Would you like me to chip in and say it?
Yes, please do, Simon.
Say it in something longer than a tweet. So the over the long history of advocating for open source, people started out mostly advocating for the adoption of commercial open off-the-shelf software alternatives for open source, and it was easy to envisage that, and it was also ultimately easy for an enthusiastic departmental level individual to implement it. But the big software that came into the public sector always came through tenders that were inevitably won by large consulting companies who inevitably deployed proprietary solutions.
Yeah.
And as we've researched recently around Europe, we found this continues to be the case. And we've also found that because of the cost-focused waterfall method managed nature of tenders, it is inevitable that even when you get open source, it ends up not engaging communities or contributing upstream. It ends up just being something that is pulled into the project and disconnected from its roots. And so the comment that I was making there is that I still think this is the big problem we have to unlock. And I'm interested always in hearing from folk in public sector open source groups to understand what they're doing to try and unlock tenders in delivering viable open source, because that will then cascade into the requirements for open source to sustain, maintain, and interact with those large tender items.
That's an interesting point. Koos, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, no, I adhere to what is being said. Like I said, I think this is really the bottleneck. Obviously, in the Netherlands, we have a tradition of big projects in a more waterfall way, and they tend to move towards a proprietary almost all the time. So what I'm trying to do now is working with colleagues who make like these kind of policies regarding our procurement procedures, and there are already there's a lot of literature and a lot of standards and whatnot they are trying to use. But a few things in there are missing. Like, for instance, if you would introduce the idea of the requirement that software which is being developed with public money should always be reusable, I would be interested to see what would happen in the procurement procedures, what kind of companies would and what kind of solutions they would propose. But really in convincing or getting my colleagues aboard with these kind of ideas is what we are working on now. It poses a big challenge.
Thank you. Gerardo has his hand up. Gerardo, I'm hoping technology is in our favor this time. Gerardo, we can't hear you, so I really hope you'll type your question this time, and I will move on to anybody else who has a question, a pressing question. I'm just looking for hands up at the moment. Okay. Noel would like to speak. Yes, please do, Noel.
Hi.
And then Monica. Sorry, after Noel and then Monica. Yes, Noel.
This is something a bit I'm not sure about, but sometimes I have the impression that certain entities go for, let's say, through procurement of public tenders with requirements and everything, thinking that it's a quick solution to what they need. From what I've seen, though, because there isn't the patience, let's say, to build and change according to what you need. And there is this impression that if you go out there and buy something ready, it's really gonna be ready. But we all know that it's never ready because it needs to change. So I'm not sure how can one transition from that mental state, to somewhere where there is a bit of more patience in building what you need when you need, which is something which is definitely a strong point of OSS.
Yeah, a good question. This is what I'm thinking about almost daily. I mean, it's a question about, we have a certain status quo, a way we are used to doing things, a way that we look at IT, and how it's managed, and yeah, I find that OSS, it's a different approach, and to give people the idea, to make them accept the idea that this might be a better approach. It is also poses different positive developments for them, that there's something for them in there as well. Yeah, this is a difficult one.
Monica?
Because thanks a lot, thanks a million for sharing the information about the toolbox. We already published the article on this toolbox, but we are happy that you could present it. And definitely what you're doing with the community platform and toolbox will also be now included in the guidelines, an example of the governmental initiative. But I am very curious to hear about the scale of your endeavor. How big is the department, open source department that you work in? And also, would you consider the structure similar to the role of OSPO, or do you intend to think about going into this direction?
Yeah, we are thinking about moving in that direction, and I think there are good reasons to do so, because at this moment we're just a small team. It's me and two other people, and this relates to the policy letter we made last year. This was after some Parliament members posed questions to our government regarding our open source policies and strategies. In the years before that, it was a non-issue. So obviously there were no people working on this committedly on this issue government-wide. Now there are a few, and we are trying to make a move to even a bigger, maybe a programs office sort of deal. But then again, there has to be also some obviously some support from Parliament, and as I mentioned, there seems to be a move towards this idea in Parliament and in creating our new government at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So we keep our fingers crossed for this development and more support for your work. Because if you are saying there are only 2-3 people working on it, I remember when we met last year, I think, and so there is a huge progress, at least what is seen, externally from our point of view. So congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm not sure if there are any other questions, but we do need to wind it down because we have a short break as well. And I'll let Barbara or perhaps Monica step in and just say when we'll regather after the break. So thank you very much, Koos, for a very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Barbara, could you please take over?
Yes, of course. So Maha mentioned a break. Monica, do you think we can have a short break until 12:30? Yeah.
So we should. On the other hand, I really worry if you all get back because this is always a risky moment, and we really can count on your feedback, on your support for our guidelines, and we can have further discussions on the topic. So if we could agree on 5-minute break for really a coffee and technical things, and please get back. Come back to us so we can continue and we have more time for discussion. This is really essential for us and for our work. Then in turn, you will all benefit, I am sure.
Yes.
So
So
5 minutes.
let's reconvene at 12:30. Let's begin. Thank you to our speakers for such engaging presentations and also for the discussions that began afterwards. I think they will lead very nicely into our next session of let's go back to the guidelines. So all the feedback that I presented before and all the questions and answers that we had in the chat, they all will feed into the update of the guidelines. And for this the second part of our webinar, we want to turn the tables around and ask you what you would like to see reflected in the guidelines by having a brainstorming session, a community cafe. And for this, we will use a supporting tool, Retrospected. My colleague will drop a link in the chat, and it's basically like any other brainstorming tool. You will be able to post post-its or comments to answer the different questions that we'll be discussing. Of course, you can also raise your voice. You can speak up to have a more fruitful discussion. And if Retrospect for some reason does not work for you, we will also be monitoring the chat. And for this tool, you can either scan the QR code or join us via the link in the chat. And you can either log in using your Google or Twitter account, or also there's an option for an anonymous login. You just simply type your name and you have the same experience as any other logged users. So you should not have too many problems, hopefully. I see some people are already joining us in this tool. And to log in, just right click on the top right. Sorry, not right, double click on the top right and we'll be able to log in. As if you're not logged in, it might be a bit more difficult for you to participate. So what I will do is I will share my screen and we can begin. One second. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Great. So the first question, which I think is kind of a recap question for us. We discussed some of the challenges already, and we discussed the structure of the guidelines in details. And the first question we want to gather your inputs on is what are the challenges that you face personally, which were not yet addressed when introducing the guidelines? We spoke extensively about community building, giving back to the community, making your project official within the community and other aspects. But when we were listening to the guidelines, was there anything that came to mind that, well, wasn't really there that you would like to see covered? And as mentioned, you can either speak up or you take, just like I'm doing now, and you hit enter and it appears. And you can also upvote or downvote other contributions from other people. Would anyone like to speak up or drop their input?
Yes, so we are also welcome to answer this question, maybe not in chat, because here we want you to do it in retrospective, but just to speak up, as Barbara said. Because then it's easier to for others to relate, react. And this is really about your experience or your knowledge about others' experience in this respect.
Yes, hopefully this is not a difficult question, as it's more about exactly your personal experiences. I see some people are still connecting. Yes, indeed, to actually be able to participate, you should log in on the side, because as spectators, you don't have the power to add your inputs. So you can log in anonymously. The point is you just need to log in still to be able to participate. And we have an input, lock-in management with already upvote. And yes, indeed, lock-in is vendor lock-in is it's a popular thing that we observe happening, and one of the reasons why it's not always easy to transition to an open source solution. Too many. So again, we go back to some of the discussions we had in the chat, that there are too many for projects which are actual healthy communities. Of course, and there's not always contributions back upstream. The lock-in is getting a lot of upvotes. Ricardo, if you would like to also maybe comment on this input, as it's receiving a lot of support, feel free to do so. Perhaps you have some advice to share here as well.
Yeah, it's been one of the key factors that, as you mentioned throughout the whole presentation, in Italy we do have some laws which greatly favor open source in general for all public administrations of Italy. The main problem, the main issue which we have faced and we still face is how there is a lack of competence, as you correctly highlighted, within the general public administration, and this means an over reliance on the vendors, and vendors that typically already provide solutions, and many of these solutions have some form, in one way or another, of lock-in. And how to solve it with open formats, how to solve it with proper contracts, and how to make public administrations aware of the fact that they need to manage this problem is one of the key issues that we are facing at this moment, and one which I think would be probably better addressed at the European level. I think we're moving in this direction, but so I'm not saying I see progress in this area, but I think it's one of the key areas where we need to still keep working and keep concentrating our efforts on.
Thank you. Would anyone like to react? Otherwise, you have some new examples. So Johan also mentioned examples of different forms of collaboration. So to go a bit deeper into that layer, for example, decentralized between municipalities through a joint association, co-owned organizations, etc. And we also have an input from Nell. Yes, this is something you were mentioning as well during the Q&A, that steering from buy off-the-shelf solution towards kind of patiently built as you need and as you go, as your requirements and needs change during the evolution of the project. Feel free to also upvote any inputs that you feel are close to your heart, or to comment on what has been added here. I think otherwise we can move. The login is getting another upvote. I think we'll have to investigate it further for sure. Then I think we can move to the next question, which was discussed a lot extensively, and I see we already have an input here. It's procurement. So it was a very big topic in the chat. Simon also made a comment about how to procure in a way that is fosters engagement and kind of giving back to the community. And here, if we would really appreciate, hearing also practical examples, because we heard it's a puzzle to solve and a key to unlock. But if you have any experiences on how this puzzle can be solved, please add them here as well. So we already have an input that there should be an index of existing open source applications available. And Maha mentioned that we should be thinking about whether the closed source projects are released as open source, and then how we can grow them again. Somebody would like to speak?
Yes, I would like just to make a comment on the index of existing open source applications.
Yes.
Just to give a pointer to fellow participants, because starting in Italy we do have such a catalog, but when we decided to build it, we decided to build it in a way where it would be possible, or it would not just be an Italian catalog, but it would be an international catalog. And as a matter of fact, we started to draw a specification. It's called the public code YAML specification, which we've opened up to other partners, namely the French, the Danish, but also in the US, in Israel, so other partners outside of the European Union. And we are on the verge of opening it up, and it's a decentralized catalog. So if anyone is interested into joining this effort of building a repository of open source applications that are maybe used in the public sector and for the government, I invite you to check out the initiative and to work with us to improve it.
Perfect. So already some practical outcome here. We also have some more inputs here over that downvote. That's interesting. When do closed source projects get released as open? When they're no longer financially viable. So Maha, I guess you're trying to prompt the discussions here a bit. Would you like to elaborate? Or not? We also have some more inputs. Request of public procurement that require the bill to deposit the code on a repository.
My mic is not working.
Maha?
Sorry, my mic is getting funny. So I was having trouble trying to get my mic back up. I'm so sorry. Well, yes, I mean, I thought that was an interesting point about the closed source projects that were raised previously. And I'm just wondering, is it because they're not financially viable? And does that signify health in a bad way already? And if it is already bad, then why would they, is that why they release it to open source? Because
Mach, I think we lost you. then we have, I'll just continue then with the inputs that request a public procurement is required to build a deposit of a repository owned by the public sector. And I think this also kind of goes in line with what Ricardo was saying earlier, that also they have this in Italy, this common repository where the code is published. And then by Gerardo to ensure transparency and fair choice. These are good principles to follow, for sure. Anyone else would like to react on procurement aspects? If no, I think then we can move on to another part that was discussed quite extensively. And I even made a note that we almost have like this motto here that in the public sector, we need knowledge, resources, and also a culture to foster open source. And this next question builds on the aspect of knowledge building. So one of the feedbacks we received to talk a bit more about competence building when it comes to open source in the public sector. And the guidelines, they talk about the setting up of OSPO and the importance of this. And Johan also touched upon this in his presentation. But in addition to this, what else can be done to build this knowledge base in the public sector, to build this competence that people understand what it means to be a part of community, that they have the capacity to contribute. We also heard from Noel that very often, and also Johan, that very often contractors, people are contracted to code or to contribute to a solution rather than it happening in-house and organically. Also in the chat, I saw conversations that it's usually a lone wolf who starts the project, and then if it's successful, it grows. But it's always also not always sustainable. So please add your inputs here, and we already have some training, of course, that's key. Regular meetups. I think that's a very important contribution to kind of foster the sense of community. And I think it's also what's done by developers Italia quite a lot, at least we learned in our case study. And also in our case studies, we saw this is a big success factor to maintain this sense of community and understanding of how the community works. Regular events, of course, similarly to meetups. Gamification, recognition for code creators and reusers. That's an interesting element as well to kind of create this motivation to contribute and have some sense of reward when you do so. If anyone would like to comment.
Sorry, Barbara, can you hear me now?
A bit better, but still not ideally.
Okay, no worries. Then I'm just going to say Johan has a question. I won't ask mine.
Yes, thank you. Yes, Johan, go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I was just thinking earlier when you talked about procurement that, and I saw that you have a question further down in this form. But when I wrote something on it in the chat before. When it's one thing procuring a software with an open source license, it's another thing to actually procure or create this community around it. That in most cases actually is where the benefits arise. Otherwise, it's more of this more transparency principle. I have one example in Sweden where they procured that the software should be open source, but they got it as a zip file with an open source license in it. So that was filling out checking out the box that they were supposed to deliver, as an open source software. But so this is really the thing here, or the main issue. I think one of the main issues in how can you grow a community or procure a community if you can even call it in those terms. And I think the Blue Hats in France and the Developers Italia are two really good examples in how you can grow a movement on the developer level between public entities, and also more formal formal collaborations, like in the OS2 collaboration in Denmark again, and how you can grow a community or an ecosystem of both vendors and public entities. So this public-private partnership ecosystem, in a way. So I think there is a need for these formal and informal communities there to reach out through and create interest. So whenever you start something, you really need to have stakeholders on board to really establish a common vision and so on. So I think these are key aspects.
Very interesting and very valid points. Also very interesting on this element of structured and both unstructured, but both can work depending on the situation. Would anyone like to react to Johan's input or a raised question? If not, then we can go back still to the knowledge and competence building. In addition to trainings, meetups, events, gamification, we also have an input on leadership and sense of urgency from the top. And absolutely, this is also something we talk about quite a lot in the guidelines, that there needs to be kind of support for the community from the management to kind of ensure that it can be sustained within the administration. And I already saw that in the chat, somebody mentioned the case of Consul, that the city of Madrid kind of stopped supporting it, but nevertheless, it's still there, but there was a change that made it less sustainable. But at the same time, we also had some comments in the chat that also this bottom-up growth is also key. So it's kind of two sides of the same coin that need to be there. Any other inputs, perhaps any thoughts on gamification, whether that has worked in practice before, to foster the sense of learning and growth in the community? I see, Niall, you have your hand raised, so maybe you would like to speak up.
Hi, yes. It's more a comment on leadership. I've noticed, first of all, that the tempo and the way things are organized from the top and the bottom are very different. Obviously, there's the high level and the lower micro. We always talk or seem to talk about support from the top down. I'm also seeing support from the bottom up, in the sense of the top, they don't care about OSS necessarily. They care, if we talk about politicians and people that actually decide on funding, they care about results, let's say, and maybe other things. But the ground people really understand, let's say, the benefits of certain things. That's why at one point in time I said, like, maybe you can cultivate a small garden and then let it grow into an actual wood, in the sense of, like, first you show what this is in terms of effectiveness, in terms of actually what it produces for the top, not for you. Because maybe reusability is good for you, but it's not necessarily what the top is in their kind of line of sight, if you know what I mean. So like an example of what we did very micro in a team that I used to manage was we developed something, we had the freedom to develop something, or rather use an element of open source to develop something. And then we showed the results. They didn't really care particularly about what the product was. They cared about IARA. Sorry, I said Maltese. Look, from 5 days work, we reduced this to 30 seconds. So that's my point. Sometimes you need to go a bit upstream and speak at the level and the language of who is actually going to fund you.
Very good point, that since you're kind of operating on administration, you have to learn the language, so to speak, of the top management, to show them the results and make sure that they see this community as valuable, also in the long run. Because like you said at the beginning, maybe it's a bit slow, but then you can show these tangible results and highlight the aspects that are important for this top management, for the hierarchy. Very interesting point. And very practical as well. Any other thoughts on this knowledge and capacity building. We saw already the demo from COS on the Dutch community that they're making, and with the Q&A aspects as well. That seems very practical and useful as well to build knowledge. But otherwise, I think I can go on to the next question, which was quite high level for us, but I think it's very important to cover on what are some good practices in your experience, but also maybe things that did not work so well and things that, well, are not to be repeated, to transition from a closed proprietary project to an open source one, and even more challenging to build a community out of this. And here as well, some people already left some inputs. So use the open source Fossology program to list all licenses used in the current project, and have the current developers participate a small bit in an existing project to mitigate their fear of exposing their work to the world. Jeroen, would you like to comment on either of these? For us also to have a bit more context behind your inputs. Or would anyone else like to comment on this?
And just small, when you say closed, you mean like you bought something pre-made and you're now considering to use open source, right?
Yes, this is our understanding. This is really kind of the feedback we got, copy-pasted, so this is all that we received. That's why also it's quite a high-level feedback that's, I guess needs a bit of interpretation, but that would be indeed what you see here.
Personally, I think that you focus on what the close doesn't give you, which is agility in changes. You don't have control on the changes. It's not yours. You are at the mercy of the proprietary vendor and its market. So if you want something which is more adaptable and malleable to your needs, then obviously there is that need. But again, for the people on the ground, not from the top management, because the top management don't necessarily understand these differences. So again, I say if you want it, build it, and then evangelize it, and create a momentum so that the top don't really have a choice but continue and moving it, because then it's like them against the world. You know what I mean?
So take your fate into your own hands and do it.
Pretty much.
Create the momentum for this. We also have an input from Johan. Similar here as well to what Noel has said, grow community and interest from the start, to onboard stakeholders early on, and have a shared vision. Indeed, I saw this also in the chat that there was some discussion that the vision is very important to unite people around a kind of common project. And then Johan also mentions to look both at the developer level, such as the blue hats, and the more formal level like OSU. So this is something, Johan, that you were also saying before, that there are these different approaches to formalize things. I'll leave a few more minutes for anyone to react or to write more inputs here, as this is a tricky one, or at least a high-level one for us to unpack.
Jeroen has one very good idea, suggested that everybody that is participating in this retrospective questions could actually look again at the answer and downvote or upvote answers, so we also see, what is your opinion, what is the most important aspects. Of course, we are going to analyze and take into account all of them, but just to use this functionality of the tool that we are actually testing for the first time, because webinars, especially on GTC, are still a bit limited. We don't have, at least for now, breakout rooms. So we are trying, apart from having great presentations from our speakers and talking to you and having exchanges in the chat and conversations, also use different tools. So this is also our attempt to check this one, which is of course open source. So if you could please just use this functionality and vote, then we can move to the last question, I believe.
Yes. Yes, there was quite a lot of active voting at the beginning. We even had some downvotes, but please go back to the questions and add your votes so that we know more or less the weight that the inputs receive. For us, this will be very useful as well. Or of course, give a shout out if you would like to comment on something. And then we have a more general question for us that's also very useful for the guidelines. We always look for good practices to highlight and to add more recommendations when of things that work well. So what good practices you have come across when it comes to interaction between open source communities and the public sector? And there's already some inputs already with some upvotes as well. Bi-weekly GISD sessions, be transparent from the project to the public. So I understand that this is similar to this kind of capacity building of meetups and events, but these are open GISD sessions for anyone interested to hear about the project and its evolution. And it's already received some upvotes, so that's a nice good practice to maintain interest and also transparency of the project, implement that transparency principle that Noel was highlighting before. Release early and release often. Do not wait too long with this. And indeed, this is something we also say in the guidelines that your community is live and the code is published. So and the code will not write itself. So it's a good practice to keep releasing it and updating it. Another input, a lot of inputs here for good practices from Gerardo. Allow for work on open source projects in-house to be counted in employee evaluation. So this also goes back to this struggle for resources and also for the aspect of do we need to hire people and pay them, and how do we motivate people to work on this in-house. So this is a very important input, and it's something we learned with one of our case studies, Digital Democracy Project in Groningen. They actually had some people that learned to develop in-house to be able to address their needs quicker and to collaborate with the community. And it was a very big move for them to have their management understand the importance of not just developing the software, but also to maintain it over time and to be for that to be counted as part of their regular work. So this, and also this is receiving a lot of upvotes. So I see this is indeed an important aspect to be highlighted. Similarly, we have bi-weekly community calls, so very similar to the GISD sessions. Again, this regular contact to foster this sense of community and to answer any, I guess, questions, challenges, or weekly wins to reward people. Similarly to what was before, developing from day one on a public platform and respond to issues and pull requests. Very true. It's also something up in the guidelines that it's very important to keep your repository active and clean, to have good documentation so that your users are attracted to use your software and contribute to it as well. Again, this means that there needs to be people dedicated to this regularly to respond to these issues and these pull requests. And we also have hackathons and competitions. So this goes back a bit to gamification, but also to kind of growing together. Hackathons and competitions to engage coders from different communities in a light and fun way. What more can we want? But I see this actually has received a downvote from somebody. Would anyone like to react to this? Because personally, I'm curious on the opinion on this.
I'll chip in, Simon.
Yes.
So one of the challenges here is breaking through the assumption that open source is a volunteer activity, and hackathons and competitions inevitably are an attempt to leverage people's spare time, and consequently, I don't think they convey the expectation that the code is actually the public body's responsibility. They convey the idea that the public body is trying to cut costs. And there is also a little bit of a risk of that in gamification as well. But gamification is a big word that can also relate to compensating employees when they engage in desirable public enhancing behaviors rather than rewarding them for their work coding.
My point here, if I can say a couple of, I mean, good point, obviously, what you said. It's to get into the people's head that coding is a way of solving problems. It's not an esoteric activity done by some kind of magical people under in a cave. If everyone codes, then we'll have bigger communities. And sometimes making it a bit of a light way, it's kind of it's showing other people that this is not just about spare time, but you can start spare time, but you can also do this as a job. So that was the idea behind this. And yes, I agree. Gamification, it's more about the reward mechanism in place for things that are of value.
Yeah, so I would agree that hackathons have a great educational value, and they contribute to the building community, and people, meet in the hackathons and create new relationships and working relationships. So definitely this type of involving coders should be continued. It's a not mainstream activity, but we have very good examples. And by the way, there was a hackathon on Jitsi. Just to anticipate your questions, Big Blue Button didn't respond to our question if they are interested in this. Basically, they were not interested. Finally, they put it clearly. So we had a hackathon with Jitsi, so there will be new features for Jitsi. And actually, the hackathon was won by a group of students from France. They were excited, and they were doing it partially in their free time, and I guess also during the coding I would say classes that they had. I don't know the details. So it's a complex thing, and here we are convinced that this is a good way of engaging coders and actually kind of influencing the culture. So yeah, and please check the results of hackathons Jitsi. It's very promising.
Thank you, Monica. Any other inputs on good practices to share? I see some upvotes on the regular meetings, on releasing early and often. I'll also scroll up to see if you had any other inputs. So it looks like we have I think everyone contributed who wanted to contribute to these questions. Either way, the retrospective, the link will continue being active for a few more days, at least for today for sure. So if something comes to mind, if you feel inspired to add some more either challenges or specific inputs on procurement or other aspects, do contribute and do let us know. Otherwise, I'll stop sharing my screen now, and we have one final question for you today. Was there anything else that we did not cover in this webinar? When we were discussing our discussions, we had a lot of different topics covered, but is there anything else that you would like to highlight or share here today? I see there's a lot of resources being also shared in the chat that we will make sure to take a closer look at. But now is the time for any final inputs and comments from your side, and feel free to unmute and to contribute. If there are then no further contributions, perhaps then yes, indeed. Thanks for bringing the slides back up. We had some buffer time for this webinar. Indeed, it seems we will be releasing you for lunch a bit earlier than anticipated. So we will move on with the conclusions. And as I said before, if you have any final thoughts, drop them in the chat or raise your hand. I'll make sure to recognize you. So really, one of the key takeaways that we want you to leave with today is that the guidelines are being updated, and we really welcome your feedback. What we have gathered today will also be very useful for us to add a bit more substance to them and also a bit more details to dig deeper into some topics and to add more recommendations. But we welcome your feedback even after this webinar. It's still ongoing. You can drop us an email at eu@ac.europa.eu, or also go to join up, and there is more ways to contribute to the guidelines. So thank you for all of you who did so today, and thank you for our speakers. And Karina, maybe next slide on some next steps. So what will happen with the guidelines after this? So firstly, we will publish the results of the webinar on OSOR. There were some questions in the chat, so both this presentation and the speaker presentations will be made available. And as mentioned by Monica, depending on the quality of the recording, we will also publish that on OSOR for you to take a look at. And we will use your input to revise the guidelines. And the feedback is ongoing. And we aim to publish the guidelines, updated guidelines on the OSOR Knowledge Center later in the summer. So this will be our summer plans, and we hope that you will take a look at the new version and share it as well. Monica, any perhaps last remarks from your side?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to our speakers, Johan and Kos. Thank you to Maha for it's always great input and helping us with managing this webinar. Thank you to Tim and all participants for your input. We will organize more webinars this year in the coming months. You have the next one on the 9th of June, and one more already scheduled for the 29th of June. There's already information, first information about those webinars published on OSOR. We will still talk about similar topics and focus on sustainability. First, on the 9th of June, we'll be looking at key aspects for successful collaboration between public administration and open source communities. We'll have speakers joining us, again, guest speakers, I mean. And next topic is public administrations adapting to the open source development culture, which was touched on a little bit during our conversation today too. So you are already warmly welcome to join us for those two events and maybe the future ones in autumn.